The tension in the studio was so thick, you could feel it pressing against your chest. Before the cameras even went live, the audience knew this wasn't going to be a polite exchange. On one side sat Denzel Washington, a man who carried truth like a weapon. On the other, Candace Owens, sharp, unapologetic, and ready to swing her own blade of rhetoric. The host barely finished introducing the topic before Candace leaned into her mic. "America has a problem," she declared, her tone dripping with challenge. "And it's not racism. It's this obsession with victimhood. Every time I turn on the TV, I hear the same tired narrative, that someone's being oppressed. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here working hard, making it happen." A pocket of the audience applauded. Candace smirked, letting the noise soak in. But Denzel didn't move. His eyes locked on hers, calm, focused, but burning with something deeper. He reached for his mic, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Opportunity?" he asked, leaning forward. "Opportunity means nothing if you've chained the door shut and kept the key for yourself. And Candace, I think you know exactly who's been holding that key." The applause died instantly. A hush fell over the studio. The camera zoomed in on Denzel's face, catching every flicker of emotion. "This country," he continued, voice firm, "is in the middle of an exam. A humanity exam. And right now, you're failing it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Candace let out a laugh, a little too loud, a little too forced, and began tapping her pen on the table. She was rattled, no matter how much she tried to hide it. The host tried to interject, but Denzel wasn't done. He leaned even closer, his gaze unblinking. "Today," he said, "we're not going to talk in numbers or charts. We're going to talk in scars. Because numbers can lie, but tears? They never do." The studio wasn't breathing. Everyone knew, this was no longer just a debate. It was about to turn into a reckoning. Candace leaned back in her chair, twirling the pen between her fingers like she was about to sign an execution order. The smirk was back, but this time it was sharper, almost defiant. "Oh, here we go," she said, shaking her head. "Another Hollywood lecture. You come in here with your dramatic pauses and your movie star gravitas, and you think that makes you an expert on reality? Newsflash, Denzel, America doesn't run on feelings. It runs on facts, hard work, and accountability. Maybe if people stopped crying and started grinding, they'd see results." Some in the audience clapped, but it was awkward, like they weren't sure if they should. Denzel's eyes narrowed, and for the first time tonight, his tone dropped lower, colder. "You call it a lecture," he said. "I call it a warning. Because when you dismiss someone's pain, you're not being strong, you're being dangerous." Candace leaned forward now, matching his posture, refusing to blink. "Dangerous," she repeated. "I'm dangerous because I refuse to baby people who've been told for decades they can't do better? I'm dangerous because I'm not buying into the victim Olympics?" "No," Denzel shot back, his voice like steel. "You're dangerous because you've mistaken cruelty for truth. You think you're lighting a torch to guide people, but all you're doing is burning the bridge behind them." The crowd reacted instantly, a low wave of murmurs, a few audible gasps. Even the host froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let it burn. Candace tilted her head, her smile fading into something sharper, more personal. "You want to talk about cruelty, Denzel? Let's talk about enabling weakness. Let's talk about telling people they can't make it without your pity." Denzel's hands tightened on the edge of the desk. The tension was radioactive now. "Candace," he said, voice slow and deliberate, "there's a difference between pity and humanity. And if you can't see it, then maybe you're not the leader you think you are." The audience erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. The host's eyes darted to the producer's booth. The control room was screaming in their headsets, "Don't you dare cut away." This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a collision. Candace leaned in so close the audience could see the glint in her eyes. "You know what I think, Denzel," she said, her voice low but dripping with venom. I think you love playing the hero when the cameras are on. You get to cry with them, rage for them, and then you go home to your gated mansion while they're still stuck where they are. That's not leadership. That's performance. A few people in the crowd actually gasped, not at the insult itself, but at how casually she said it, like it was a fact carved in stone. Denzel didn't move. Didn't flinch. He just looked at her, too long. The kind of stare that makes people uncomfortable because it says more than words ever could. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice so quiet it forced everyone to stop shifting in their seats just to hear him. Candace, he said, I've buried friends. I've seen mothers hold their sons in the street. I've walked neighborhoods where the cameras don't go, and stayed when they left. You think that's performance? No. That's life. That's what it looks like when you don't run. The studio fell into a vacuum, no shuffling papers, no whispered side talk, just a heavy, almost suffocating stillness. Even Candace blinked, like she hadn't expected the hit to land that hard. Then Denzel added, almost as if to himself but loud enough for everyone to hear. You don't get to tell me where I stand. I've earned my place. That was it. The dam broke. Half the audience was on its feet cheering, the other half whispering furiously into their phones, already tweeting what they'd just witnessed. Candace sat back, lips tight, gripping her pen like it might snap in her fingers. She knew he'd just taken control of the room, and she'd have to fight like hell to take it back. Candace forced a slow, practiced smile, the kind that said I'm not rattled even when every muscle in her jaw was working overtime. She leaned toward her microphone, tilting her head just enough to make it seem like she was addressing the audience instead of Denzel. See, this is what I mean, she began, her tone suddenly calm, too calm. You wrap your words in pain so no one dares challenge you. And if they do, you throw their humanity back at them, as if they've never fought for anything themselves. But you're not the only one who's been in the trenches, Denzel. Some of us fight every single day, just not on camera. The audience stirred. A few claps. A few scoffs. The energy shifted, no longer fully in Denzel's corner. She could feel it, and she pressed harder. You talk about burying friends? I've watched communities tear themselves apart because so-called leaders told them they were powerless without someone to save them. And you, Denzel, you like being that savior. It keeps you relevant. That last word hit like a dart. Relevant. It wasn't about truth now, it was about cutting his image. The moderators glanced at each other, debating whether to step in, but the crowd was locked in too tightly. Denzel sat still, his hand resting on the table, thumb slowly rubbing against the edge of a folded piece of paper, a note he'd brought but hadn't read yet. He let her keep talking. You think truth is this magic wand you wave over people's lives, Candace continued, leaning forward, but truth without action is just theater. And if we're being honest, you've been in Hollywood a lot longer than you've been in these streets. That one got murmurs. It was the kind of jab that played well to her base, the kind that would be clipped, memed, and shared before the show even ended. And then Denzel's head lifted, slow, controlled. His voice came out even, but with an edge that made people instinctively sit up straighter. Candace, he said, you confuse the stage with the spotlight. One's a place to speak. The other is a place to be seen. I've stood on both, and I know the difference. It was a warning shot. And the way the crowd reacted, half cheers, half uneasy silence, told her they knew round two was about to get ugly. The lights above the panel glared a little brighter, or maybe it just felt that way. Denzel kept his eyes locked on Candace as his thumb unfolded the paper he'd been rubbing between his fingers. The sound of the crease breaking was faint, but in the tense quiet that had settled over the room, it might as well have been a gunshot. He laid the sheet flat on the table and slid it forward, not to her, but to the moderator. Read it, he said simply. The moderator hesitated, glancing between them. What is this? Something Candace didn't expect anyone here to see, Denzel replied, his voice calm, almost too calm. A transcript from last year. Her words, her signature. Candace's confident posture faltered just a fraction. Her eyes darted to the paper, then back to him. You're really going to dig up? I'm really going to show the truth, he cut in. Because you said truth without action is theater. Well, consider this opening night. The moderator cleared his throat and began to read. There are times when it's easier to ignore human suffering than to acknowledge it, especially if it costs you politically. The room went silent. Denzel didn't break eye contact. You said those words, Candace. Not me. You signed off on policy that cut funding to the very programs you now claim to champion. And tonight, you sit here telling America you're in the trenches? Candace's lips tightened. Context matters. He leaned in. So does courage. And neither can be faked. The audience reacted in a wave, gasps, applause, a few shouts. The kind of energy that signaled the moment would live far beyond this broadcast. Candace shifted in her chair, clearly calculating her next move. And Denzel? He just sat back, hands clasped, letting the weight of the paper, and the truth it carried, fill every corner of the room. Candace didn't touch the paper. Didn't even glance at it again. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and leaned toward the microphone with that signature smirk, the one she wore right before going for the jugular. So that's it, she said, her voice slow and deliberate. A line pulled from a closed-door discussion, without context, without the full conversation. You're a great actor, Denzel, but this is pure theater. The crowd reacted with a mixture of groans and applause, exactly the split she wanted. She wasn't talking to Denzel anymore. She was talking to the viewers at home, the ones who already distrusted the media, the ones ready to believe she was being set up. I've sat in rooms, she continued, where people speak in hypotheticals, in strategic terms. That's not the same as endorsing cruelty. But you, Denzel, you're reading scripts while others are making real sacrifices. Denzel leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. The only sacrifice here is the truth you left behind when you signed that bill. Candace's eyes narrowed. You want to talk about signing things? Let's talk about the Hollywood contracts you've signed, the ones with studios that fund propaganda overseas. Should we hold you accountable for every project tied to injustice? The air in the room thickened. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in closer, hungry for the next blow. The moderator's pen hovered over his notes like he might need to referee at any second. Candace smiled again, this time without warmth. Be careful, Denzel. You brought receipts, but I've got my own. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in gasps. The battle lines had been drawn even deeper, and now, nobody was quite sure who would land the next decisive hit. Candace reached into the folder at her side, the one she'd kept closed since the start of the debate. The sound of paper sliding against paper was almost too loud in the tense silence. She pulled out a single stapled document, waved it briefly for the cameras, then set it down with a deliberate thump. You think you've cornered me, Denzel, she said, her tone razor sharp. Let's talk about your selective morality. This, she tapped the document, is a transcript from a 2015 panel you sat on, where you dismissed questions about U.S. foreign policy as, and I quote, not my fight. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Denzel didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. Candace leaned in, her voice low but amplified enough for every microphone. Funny how your silence back then didn't bother you, but now you're the loudest voice in the room. Could it be that outrage is easier when it comes with applause? The moderator glanced at Denzel, clearly bracing for an explosion. Cameras zoomed in on his face, catching the flicker of something, anger, maybe, or resolve. That's cute, Denzel replied, finally breaking the pause. His tone was calm, but there was an edge under every word. You're quoting a decade-old snippet, ignoring that the very next line was me saying, but it should be my fight. You didn't bring the whole truth, Candace. You brought a half-truth with a spotlight. The crowd reacted instantly, gasps, shouts, scattered applause. Candace's smirk faltered for the first time, but she recovered quickly. "This isn't about truth, Denzel. It's about who gets to control the narrative," she shot back. "And that," Denzel said, leaning so close his voice dropped into something intimate and dangerous, "is why you keep failing the humanity test." The room erupted, and the moderator's attempts to regain control were drowned out by the chaos. Candace straightened in her seat, the smirk gone. Her eyes locked on Denzel like a predator circling prey, but there was something new in her expression, urgency. She glanced toward the moderator, then back to the cameras, clearly preparing a swing that wasn't in the original playbook. "You know what's really sad," she began, her voice shaking just enough to sound raw. "You act like the moral compass for America, but when it comes to your own circles, Hollywood, your silence is deafening. Where were you when your friends were exploiting people, Denzel, when the cameras weren't rolling? Or does your so-called humanity only show up when it gets you headlines?" The words hit like a slap. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even the production crew exchanged quick glances. This wasn't just political theater anymore. Candace was going personal, and she was going for blood. Denzel's hands rested on the table, fingers interlocked. He didn't interrupt. His stillness only made her voice sound louder. Candace reached under the desk and pulled out a glossy 8x10 photo, holding it high so the audience and every camera could see. "Recognize this? That's you at a private fundraiser, laughing with one of the very men you later condemned on TV. You want to talk about half-truths? How about this full picture?" Gasps filled the air. The moderator's eyes widened. This was off-script, a live ambush. For a long beat, Denzel didn't even glance at the photo. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned to look at it. A small, humorless smile crossed his face. "Thank you for proving my point," he said, leaning into his mic. "You can throw up a still frame from any moment in my life and twist it into whatever story you need. That's the difference between you and me, Candace. I bring receipts and the full context. You bring snapshots and hope people don't ask questions." The crowd roared, some in support, some in protest, and the moderator's voice was lost again under the chaos. Candace's face tightened. Her play hadn't landed the knockout she wanted. The crowd's noise was still echoing when Denzel reached into his leather briefcase. No theatrics, no rush. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. He pulled out a thick manila folder, its edges frayed from handling, and placed it gently on the table. Candace's eyes followed the motion, her smirk returning like she'd already decided whatever he had was irrelevant. But when Denzel flipped the folder open, the studio lighting caught a series of embossed seals, signatures, and letterheads, official documents, the kind you couldn't Photoshop without leaving a trail. "You want the whole picture?" Denzel said, his tone flat but dangerous. He lifted the first sheet and held it toward the camera. "This is a transcript of the very meeting you're trying to frame me with. Full date, full attendee list, and, here's the fun part, the topic. It wasn't about exploitation. It was about securing funding for an inner-city youth program. The man you're trying to use as my albatross? He was forced out 2 weeks later after we confronted him about misconduct. And guess who's on the email chain asking us to keep it quiet?" He let the question hang, eyes locked on Candace. The audience leaned forward like a single organism. Denzel tapped the next page. That's your signature, Candace. That's you telling everyone to avoid making it public so it wouldn't distract from the campaign." The studio erupted. The moderator's jaw dropped. Candace's face lost its color, her lips parting in a silent inhale she couldn't seem to release. "I don't do this for clicks," Denzel continued, his voice cutting clean through the noise. "I don't wave pictures around without knowing the truth. And I sure as hell don't bury it when it's inconvenient." He slid the documents toward her side of the table. "So here's your full picture. Feel free to read it aloud. The people deserve to hear it from you." Candace didn't touch the papers. Her hand hovered for a second, then dropped to her lap. The silence in that moment was heavier than the shouting had been minutes earlier. The room felt frozen, as if the air itself had turned solid. Every camera was locked on Candace, but she wouldn't meet Denzel's eyes. The papers sat untouched in front of her, damning, undeniable. Denzel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms slowly, not in victory, but in something heavier, disappointment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough that the studio had to lean in to hear it. "You see," he began, "it's easy to stand up here and talk about morals when you think nobody has the receipts. It's easy to preach about truth when you assume your hands will never be held to the fire. But the moment the spotlight turns your way," he nodded toward the folder, "that's when the real character shows." Candace shifted in her seat, her lips tightening. The moderator tried to jump in, but Denzel raised a hand, not to silence him, but to hold the moment still. "I'm not here to ruin anyone," he said. "I'm here to remind you. And everyone watching, that power without accountability is just corruption in a nicer suit. You don't get to bury the truth because it's inconvenient. And you don't get to twist it into a weapon against the people fighting for it." A faint murmur rippled through the audience, then fell silent again. Denzel's eyes stayed locked on Candace. "You failed the test, Candace," he said finally, the words heavy but calm. "Not because you lied, but because you thought you could, and we'd all just let it slide. Well, not today." The camera zoomed in as Candace exhaled, her gaze dropping to the table. Denzel didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply gathered his papers, placed them back in his case, and stood. And with that, he delivered the last line without turning back. "Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be heard." The studio exploded, half in applause, half in stunned silence, and the network cut to a commercial before anyone could breathe again. In a world where voices fight to be the loudest, Denzel proved something bigger: the truth doesn't compete with noise, it silences it. Candace may have had the microphone, but Denzel had the facts. And in the end, facts always win.